This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Alvaro Barrington. Barrington is a London-based painter who uses a variety of materials in the production of his visionary art. His work takes on many forms, but always strives for cultural authenticity. In the conversation, we talk about his influences, his worldview, in his latest show, up now through April 30th at Blum-and-poe in LA. And now, the thoughts and philosophies of Alvaro Barrington. Alvaro Barrington, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Alvaro, a lot of times with artists, I like to start kind of at the same place, and that's with the hypothetical. If you were to sit down at a dinner next to somebody at a dinner party who's never heard of you or seen your work, how would you describe it to them?
I try not to describe my work to people because I feel like it's like it does it a real big disservice. Although I went to art school, and most of art school is like learning how to talk about your art. But it's really interesting because there's these sort of like different lens, which is like philosophical, sometimes economical, like Marxist or whatever. There's all these sort of different lenses that you go through in order to learn how to speak about art in art school. But I found that doesn't, when I stand in front of any art, that really kind of doesn't do the art any real justice, and that oftentimes has been developed as a way for people to like start a conversation. So they'll look at an artwork, and whatever lens they're looking at, they'll kind of use that lens as the means of which to sort of like get into whatever interest that they have.
Some artists that I talk to, their work's very recognizable. They're late career artists. They've been making things that look very similar for a long time. But my perception of you is that you're someone who likes to draw on a variety of cultural references, and you like to experiment a lot with materials. And so the result of that is it's kind of hard to put your finger on something that looks like Alvaro's work because it feels like it's always changing. Would you agree with that?
So yeah, and I think part of it is because one of the ways that I think about making is like thinking about like the material condition of a place. And I remember it kind of started with like a writing that I read from Felix Gonzalez Torres, where he was talking about like these sort of minimalist sculptures from the 60s from like America, like and he was sort of referencing that these artists were sort of looking for a sense of universality when they were making minimalism. And there was this idea that, if you bump into the sculpture, that you are bumping into something universal. And what Felix Gonzalez Torres said was, no, you're basically that sculpture was made from like someone in the industrial who's like on the winning side of the Industrial Revolution. And so a lot of those sort of like big, heavy, like steel sculptures was easily accessible for someone where that kind of production was affordable, easily available. And so, he kind of used like candies from the corner store, the cheap 25-cent candy. And that was sort of his sort of like what was available for him. But I always think about like if I'm changing different subject matters, or I'm addressing different ideas, then there's probably something materially that can inform that. And so not just like and so like if you look at some paintings from the Caribbean, maybe you have more access to burlap or hessian or like
Hmm.
cocoa sacks. And if you're in the Netherlands or New York or London, you probably have access to, you go to an art store and there's cotton. There's, you know what I mean? You're going to find
Right.
cotton or linen in the art store. And so, there's just, yeah. So I just kind of think about when I'm thinking through different ideas. One starting point is usually the material condition of a place.
Well, that reminds me of conversations I've heard where Mark Bradford talks about when he was first starting out, he was looking for something that was affordable and accessible, and he had grown up in a hair salon, and his family was into hairstyling, and he got into it, and there are these little tissue paper, like rice paper strips that they use whenever they're
Yep.
setting curlers. And like he could get like 100 or 200 for like $2. And, his first works, I mean, it was a matter of convenience, but it was also, in terms of like the materiality you're talking about, it reflected his roots, right?
Yeah.
How has that manifested itself in your artwork before? Like, what is the material on hand that kind of speaks to you and in your culture and your work?
I mean, I think first thing, yeah. I mean, Mark's a great example of someone. I mean, I also thought about him and like his advertisement, paper advertisement. But it
Hmm.
also like you have the Italian Arte Povera. I think there's sort of like on a large scale, the default for art making has become like standardized by the Northeast region, who has kind of dominated the imagination of what a painter means
Hmm.
since like post-war America, since like Pollock, the Abex painters, and so on. So there's this sort of like default, like kind of centralizing idea of like, oh, these artists, if you're a painter, these are sort of your default materials. But it's kind of interesting because even back then, um, like artists like Franz Klein, a lot of the artists they use like house paint, for example, or
Hmm.
Pollock used enamel. So they were also using the materials that was localized to them. Um, but it just we kind of take it for granted because those become the standard because they became kind of the face of what we think about as a as painting, or oil paint becomes like the Dutch, who was kind of the imperial, like the world power for a very long time,
Hmm.
um, before England. They mastered oil paints, and so we kind of defaulted to oil paint being the standard of what we think about as paint material, because the Dutch had kind of built their wealth on trade, right? And so they could
Right.
get like materials from they could get certain blues from Afghanistan or
Hmm.
other colors, and because they had kind of dominated trade, they had access to new materials that, and they were able to like also paint like these beautiful flowers because they had access to new colors, new
Right.
material colors. So I
Yeah.
think I think yeah, I think we kind of these things become like so uh like devoid of the context of which how those materials come to be in front of us, that we kind of don't realize that, oh, these artists are speaking to the material condition. It only becomes like a bit shocking when it's like, maybe otherized by race or gender or whatever, or
Sure.
like maybe not being from the Northeast. It
Yeah.
also depends. I mean, to kind of get back to your point, I mean, I kind of embody, like, I went to like I could easily embody like a Northeast artist. I went to all the schools out. I grew up in New York. I went to art schools. I went to MoMA. I think probably the first time I'd probably say is 12 years old or something like that. I can't really, you know. And so I went to school across the street from, you know, a few minutes away from the Met and all of these places. So I kind of grew up in the epicenter of it. So if I wanted to sort of default to these sort of material conditions, I can. But I also thought that it was maybe a bit too lazy and limiting for me to kind of frame myself within a very specific standard that was created 500 years ago.
What you're saying reminds me of a personal anecdote, and as my wife was telling me a story about how her mom, whenever her mom would cook a ham, her mom would always cut off the end of the ham. And one time she asked her mom, like, why do you cut off the end of the ham? It's like, well, that's the way we always did it growing up. Like, well, but why? And so her mom called her grandmother and said, hey, you're the one who taught me how to do this. Why do we always cut off the end of the ham? She said, because it wouldn't fit in my pan otherwise. And so so, you know, the reason that there's this tradition started was for something very practical, which had nothing to do with the current state, right? And so, our need to like work on, in tempera on panel or oil on canvas, that really isn't necessary anymore. And so why not work with concrete, right?
Yeah. Or any of the, I mean, I think modernism has kind of always been, I mean, the history of art has always been like, why not work with the thing that's in front of you?
Right.
But I do think like, you know, as certain things become like codified and loses its kind of that sort of origin story, it doesn't fit in the pot anymore, then we you know, it just becomes like a default law that people, you know, it's like you'll bump into someone and say, oh, you make paintings? What do you use, oil or acrylic?
Right.
And I could tell that's because they went to art school or they did an art class and the professor or the lecturer sat in front of them and said, oh, if you're a painter, you use oil or acrylic. And that kind of becomes like, you know, like the lazy entry into making paintings. But I think people who've made paintings for thousands of years, it also kind of creates this weird hierarchy because it also like centralizes. If you think of painting as being oil or acrylic, what it does is that it starts painting at a very particular period, right? Because it means that anything else that hasn't made, you know, didn't put oil or acrylic doesn't in your imagination get qualified as a painting, you know. And then you go like, well, what if Matisse or the modernist painters weren't looking at Japanese prints?
Right.
You know, like
yeah.
No,
and I think it's, you know, it's a really interesting conversation because I feel like there's a changing hierarchy in art. And I feel like sculpture has really risen in the ranks in terms of its respect in the hierarchy. And so that, you know, the acceptance of sculpture being close to the top of the hierarchy kind of opens us up to appreciating a whole different set of materials versus, you know, oil or acrylic, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the word hierarchy is interesting to me because I think that's also part of the false narrative that we've gotten. You know, art is really about how we engage our lived experience, and how do we find like truth, and how do we find community, and I think and how do we find someone else's truth,